In game 13 of 1951 World Championship match, the world champion Mikhail Botvinnik got a slight advantage in the opening, and could have increased it if he had found an energetic move which would let him seize the initiative. However, he missed this hidden resource and made a more natural-looking move. After this, the challenger David Bronstein showed a very high defensive technique. First, he got rid of his weak pawns, then activated his pieces, which led to the exchange of queens, and finally sacrificed a pawn in the arising endgame to create weaknesses in Botvinnik's position and penetrate into the second rank with his rooks. Botvinnik started with d4, and Bronstein played Nmco Indian defense this time, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. Here white has many different ways of playing. For example, one of the most popular moves is a3, which leads to the immediate exchange on c3, after which white gets the advantage of two bishops, but the pawn structure is damaged. White has double pawns on c-file and isolated pawn on a3. And black usually attack c4 pawn, and it would be impossible for white to defend it, as after b6, bishop a6, first bishop attacks it, then knight from a5 attacks it, then after c5 and opening of c-file, the rook from c8 joins the attack, so c4 falls. But white in his turn starts the attack on the king side and creates dangerous threats to black king. Botvinnik, however, in this game, instead of immediate a3, played another variation, e3, Rubinstein variation. The idea is to first develop the knight on e2, defending the knight on c3, and only then play a3. And if black exchanges on c3, then the knight on e2 would replace the knight on c3, and the pawn structure would remain intact. Bronstein played b6, so black would either fianchetto the bishop, exerting pressure on the long diagonal and controlling very important central squares, or play bishop a6, attacking c4. Knight e2, bishop b7, and now that the knight is on e2, a3. In this position, black has two options, either to spend a tempo and retreat on e7, retaining the bishop pair, or what Bronstein did. In order not to waste the tempo, just exchange on c3. And knight takes c3, white has the advantage of two bishops now. Bronstein castled kingside, and Botvinnik played bishop d3, developing the bishop and leaving the pawn on g2 unguarded. However, it turns out that accepting the sacrifice would be too dangerous, because after bishop takes g2, the g-file opens and white rook will join the attack, and white would have a very strong attack on the king. Bronstein gives following variation, rook g1, bishop b7, e4, opening the dark squared bishop's diagonal and threatening very unpleasant pin. On g5, the bishop would pin the knight, and white would threaten deadly e5, attacking with a pawn the pinned knight. In order to avoid it, knight e8 would be possible. However, knight on f6 was controlling h5 square, and now it's not controlled, so the queen joins the attack. And white is threatening to play e5 with terrible checkmating threats on h7. That's why g6, still e5, because the queen is untouchable, of course, because the pawn is pinned. Knight g7 attacking the queen, queen h6, f5 to block the bishop's diagonal. However, now the h-pawn joins the attack in order to weaken the king side, h4, king h8, bishop g5 attacking the queen, queen e8, bishop f6 with checkmating threat on g7, and after queen f7, h5, black's position would just collapse after h takes g. That's why after bishop d3, Bronstein of course didn't capture on g2 and played c5, attacking the center. In his annotations, Bronstein writes that later he understood that he came to conclusion that instead of c5, d5 is much stronger. But in this game he played c5. And Botvinnik crosses the center of the board and grabs space, d5. Bronstein played b5 in order to sharpen the game and create some tactical complications, but Botvinnik, as usual, avoids any complications. He doesn't capture on b5 and plays just solid positional chess, castle kingside, ignoring b5. B takes c, bishop takes c4, e takes d, knight takes d5, knight c6. So, of course, in this position, it would be bad for white to win a pawn after knight takes f6, queen takes f6, queen takes d7. attacking the bishop, because black would just defend the bishop, rook b8, and it turns out that black pieces are very active. The next move would be knight e5, attacking both the queen and the bishop. Both of them are loose, and it turns out that black pieces are very active. The knight is great on e5, the bishop is great on b7, the rook exerts pressure on the open file, the queen is very active, while white hasn't finished the development yet. The dark squared bishop isn't developed, the rook isn't developed, so black would have great compensation and initiative for the sacrificed pawn. That's why Botvinnik played b3. This is a natural looking move, opening the bishop, square, for vacating the square for the dark squared bishop, and the bishop, which is currently passive, would be just great on b2, exerting pressure on long diagonal and creating threats to black king. And also b3 defends the bishop, which is loose. However, instead of this, it would have been much stronger, much more energetic, with the same idea to play b4 instead of b3. That would be more active because it would come with tempo. White would still play bishop b2, but it would come with tempo because c5 is under attack. And Bronstein gives the following variation. For example, if black plays knight e5, as the bishop isn't protected, attacking the bishop, white can just ignore this threat and still play bishop b2, attacking the knight, and capturing on c4 would be a mistake because of knight takes f6 check, g takes f, and queen g4 check, with double attack, attacking the knight. So the knight would fall, and black's king side is demolished, f6 is a terrible weakness, and the bishop is attacking this weakness. And the catastrophe on dark squares is just unavoidable. It's impossible to defend f6. Black pieces would... f6 would need constant protection, but it would still fall because the queen would also join the attack of f6, and black, of course, is losing in this position. Or, instead of knight e5, Sveshnikov, who also annotated this game, gives following variations. If c takes b, then just a takes b, knight d5, bishop d5, queen b6 to defend the bishop so that the knight can move, bishop b2, knight e7, exchange of bishops, and queen d4. With a very strong battery, there is a checkmating threat. White is much better because black also has weakness on d7. The bishop is much stronger than the knight, and white has very strong initiative. Or, instead of c takes b, if knight takes d5, then just bishop takes d5, queen b6, bishop b2, knight e7, exchange of bishops, and queen d6, attacking both the knight and the pawn. So, in all of these variations, after b4, white would have very strong initiative and a very good position. But instead of this, Botvinnik played less active, b3. However, still, white has a slight advantage. Knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, rook b8, bishop b2. So, now white is threatening to play queen g4 with very unpleasant threats to g7. That's why Bronstein reroutes his knight to the king side, to the defense of king side. Knight e7. And after queen g4, knight g6. So, in order not to weaken the king side with pawn moves, the knight goes to the defense of the king side. Exchange of bishops, and now b4. But b4 would have been much more effective some moves ago in the positions that I showed. At first sight, black's position is bad because black has many weaknesses. Isolated pawn on a7. The pawns on c5 and d7 are also weak, and they are placed on open files, so white can exert pressure on them. The bishop is much stronger than the knight, as the bishop is stronger than knight when there are pawns on both sides, on the king side and the queen side. So when there is a play on both sides, bishop can control, can attack both sides, but knight cannot do it. However, now Bronstein starts very instructive defensive operations, active defense. First, he gets rid of his weaknesses on c5 and a7. He plays active move a5. So white, of course, cannot capture any of these pawns because the bishop would fall. And it turns out that the pawns, all of these 4 pawns, would be unavoidably exchanged. So bishop c3, a takes b, c takes b, bishop takes b4. So all the pawns on the queen side disappeared. And now the bishop isn't much stronger than the knight. Now that the main battlefield is only king side, there is no play on the queen side. Now the bishop isn't stronger than the knight, and black has only one weakness on d7 left. So currently the rook on f8 is under attack, so rook e8, bishop c3, queen h4, offering the exchange of queens, after which white wouldn't have any initiative whatsoever. That's why Botvinnik avoids the exchange of queens and plays queen f3, attacking the rook on b7. However, now that the queen moved away from g4, the knight can move, because from g4 the queen was attacking g7, and if the knight moved, checkmate would follow. But now the queen moved and the knight is free to move. And after rook c7 attacking the bishop and bishop d4, Bronstein reroutes his knight on g6, which is passive, to e6, knight f8, and on e6 the knight would be much more active, attacking the bishop and taking under control very important central squares. Rook a5, knight e6, attacking the bishop, bishop e5, rook c6, bishop g3, queen c4, rook d5, attacking d7, knight c5, defending it, rook d4, queen e6, and it turns out that black pieces are very active. The queen, the rook, the knight, another rook. And that's why Botvinnik offers the exchange of queens and hopes, after the exchange of the queens, to exert some pressure in the arising endgame on d7. So black is still worse, because d7 is a weakness. h6, h3, rook a8. So the rook wasn't doing much on e8, but on a8 it's placed on the open file, and when the appropriate time comes, the rook can move to a2 on the second rank and can be very active. Rook d1, the queens are exchanged, and in this position it looks at first sight that white is better, because the pawn is weak, white is exerting pressure on d7, the knight cannot move, it seems, because it must defend the pawn on d7. The rook must defend the knight, so it cannot move from the c file. But Bronstein again finds the way of active defense. He plays knight e4, leaving d7 unguarded, but creating his own threats. After knight takes g3, white would be forced to capture with f-pawn, and the pawn structure would be damaged. e3 would be weak, and another threat is knight c3 with a fork. And if white plays bishop e5 in order to parry both of these threats, rook a2 would follow, attacking f2 2 times. And after f3, knight c3 with a fork, white would be forced to exchange. And after rook takes c3, black is threatening rook c2, doubling on the second rank with terrible threats, and also attacking e3 pawn. So in this position, of course, white doesn't have any advantage. That's why after knight e4, Botvinnik just captured on d7, winning a pawn. However, after knight takes g3, f takes g, this extra pawn is weak, isolated pawn, and black's rook suddenly activate. Rook a2, threatening very unpleasant rook c2, doubling on the second rank, creating threats. That's why Botvinnik was forced to exchange a pair of rooks to prevent rook c2. Rook d2, rooks are exchanged, king f8. So white has an extra pawn. However, it's impossible, almost impossible. If black plays correctly, it's impossible to convert this advantage. So g4, king e7, knight f2, rook f6. Botvinnik still tries to play for victory, but Bronstein defends precisely. Rook f5, king f8, rook f6, king g7, defending h6, rook d6, rook b2, g3, rook a2, h4, rook h2, attacking h4, threatening to win a pawn after the exchange on h4, but rook d1, indirectly defending h4, because g takes h, rook takes h4 would be a terrible blunder because of king g3, and the rook is trapped. That was the idea of rook d1, to take under control h1 square, and the rook doesn't have any squares to retreat. Of course, Bronstein didn't capture on h4 and played king f6, e4, king g6, h5, king f6, rook d6 check, king g7, e5, rook h1, e6. The pawns are exchanged, rook f1, king e4, rook e1 check, king d5, rook d1 check, and in this position they agreed to a draw. Hit the like button, as it's really helpful for the channel growth, and see you in the analysis of game 14.